What happens when you step into a house that has been waiting for you for centuries? The walls, the whispers, the souls trapped inside. It's not just a place. It's a living nightmare. Watch until the end, because you won't believe what happens when the house gets hungry again. Stay with us, because this story will haunt you. The first time they stepped into the house, it felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with something they couldn't quite place. A musty odor lingered, mingling with the faint scent of decay. The walls, once white, were now stained, yellowed, peeling in places. The house had an eerie silence, like it was holding its breath. They could hear nothing but the sound of their own footsteps echoing through the darkened hallways. Peter Chadwick had been missing for days, but his home was untouched, frozen in time. The officers moved cautiously through the rooms. Their flashlights flickered in the dimness, casting long, unsettling shadows. It was then they saw it. The living room at the end of the hallway. A strange, chilling sight. A figure, sitting on the couch, perfectly still. The officer, who was closest, stopped in his tracks. His heart thudded in his chest, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. He looked again. The figure on the couch was motionless, too still. And yet there was something wrong. The man sitting there wasn't right. It wasn't Peter Chadwick. The face was gaunt, the eyes wide open, staring vacantly into space. A grotesque, frozen grin pulled at the corners of the mouth. But it wasn't just the face. It was the hands. The hands were twisted, fingers bent in unnatural angles, clenched in tight, painful-looking fists. The officer stepped forward, his breath shallow, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He reached out a trembling hand. The cold of the body made him jump back. It was too cold, too unnatural. The air seemed to thicken around him. The room felt alive, but in a suffocating, oppressive way. And then he heard it, a soft, faint scratching noise. It came from somewhere deeper inside the house. A voice in his head screamed to leave, to get out. But his body wouldn't listen. The others were still frozen, just as shaken, just as confused. The scratching grew louder, closer. It was impossible. No one was supposed to be there. But it was undeniable. They weren't alone. The scratching came again. A slow, deliberate sound, dragging across the floor. The officers turned toward the hallway, eyes wide, heartbeats hammering in their chests. The noise was getting louder, more frantic, like someone was trying to get out. The air around them grew colder, heavier. It pressed down on them, suffocating. One of the officers, his breath ragged, took a step forward, then another. His flashlight flickered, casting unsettling shadows along the walls. Each step felt like it took longer, like time was stretching. And then they saw it. The door to the basement. It was slightly ajar. The scratching was coming from below. The officer reached for the handle. His hand shook uncontrollably. He could hear his own breath now, shallow and frantic, almost deafening in the silence. The others watched, frozen, not daring to move. The officer pulled open the door. A rush of cold air hit them, swirling around their legs like a gust of wind. The basement was dark. Too dark. And the scratching, it had stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the deep, suffocating silence. Then, a faint, raspy breath echoed up from the darkness. The officer swallowed hard. "Who's down there?" he called out, voice trembling. No answer. But the sound of movement came next. Slow, deliberate footsteps shuffling across the floor. The officer's heart pounded in his throat. He couldn't see a thing, but something was down there. Something alive. The other officers stepped back, their faces pale, sweat dripping down their foreheads. Suddenly, a low, guttural laugh echoed from the darkness. A laugh that was wrong. A laugh that scraped against their nerves, clawing at their sanity. It was as if whatever was down there was toying with them. And then, the figure emerged from the shadows. A face. A twisted, deformed face, covered in dirt and grime. The eyes were wide, unblinking, but there was no humanity in them. Just something hollow, something that shouldn't exist. And in that moment, the officers' minds shattered. They couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. What was it? What had they stumbled into? The air was suffocating, thick with the stench of rot. And that thing that was once human, took a step forward. The officers froze, rooted to the spot. The thing in front of them took another slow, deliberate step. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like it hadn't quite figured out how to walk properly. Its skin, pale and mottled, stretched tightly across the bones, as if it were struggling to hold itself together. The officer closest to it could hear the soft, wet sound of its breath. He could feel the temperature drop even further. It was as if the world around them had ceased to exist. Nothing made sense. And yet, this thing was real. It was there. It reached out with a trembling hand. Its fingers were too long, too thin, like twisted branches. The officer stumbled back, gasping for air. But it wasn't just fear now. There was something else. A pressure. A force pressing in from all sides. The other officers, too, were paralyzed by what they were seeing. No one could speak. No one could move. The thing opened its mouth. A raspy sound came from its throat, like nails scraping across glass. It spoke, but not in words. It was a series of gurgling, incomprehensible noises. A voice that shouldn't exist. The officer who had stepped forward finally found his voice, though it was barely a whisper. "What are you?" The thing tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then, with an eerie calm, it smiled. A twisted grin spread across its face, wide and sickening. The eyes, they didn't blink. They stared straight into theirs, unblinking, unseeing. It was as though it could see into their very souls. And for a moment, it felt like time had stopped altogether. The thing stepped closer, its breath coming faster now, more erratic. The officers recoiled, panic surging through them. But they couldn't move fast enough. The air thickened even more. A deep, rumbling growl erupted from the creature's throat. It was no longer human, not in any way they understood. One of the officers couldn't take it anymore. He turned, running for the stairs. But the creature was faster. With one swift motion, it lunged. A scream echoed through the house. But it wasn't a scream of terror. It was something else. A sound that was beyond comprehension. The others stood frozen. They couldn't look away. Not even when the figure dragged its victim down into the depths of the basement, disappearing into the dark. The room was silent once more, except for the sound of breathing. The officers knew then. There was no escaping this place. And whatever had happened to Peter Chadwick was only the beginning. The silence hung heavy in the air. It was suffocating, oppressive. The remaining officers stood motionless, their faces drained of color. One by one, they realized they had no idea what to do. The thing had taken their own, dragged him into the abyss. And they were left, helpless, with nothing but the cold. The flashlight in the officer's trembling hand flickered and went out. The darkness seemed to close in, wrapping around them like a thick, suffocating blanket. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls. A strange energy that made the hairs on their necks stand up. They turned toward the basement door. It was ajar, just a crack, as if inviting them in. But none of them could move. Not anymore. The pressure was too much. The air tasted like metal, bitter and sharp. Their lungs burned, struggling to breathe. From the depths below, they could hear something moving again. Shuffling. Scratching. A sound that was neither human nor animal. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. Something was coming, and they couldn't stop it. A soft, wet sound echoed through the hallway. A footstep. Then another. Closer. Closer. A figure emerged from the darkness. A silhouette, barely visible in the dim light. It was too tall, too thin, like a shadow stretched impossibly long. The officers stood frozen, eyes wide with terror. The figure moved forward, each step slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the fear in the room. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, raspy, like it had been buried alive. "Peter," it whispered, its eyes glinting in the darkness. The officer's heart stopped. The thing stepped into the light, its face grotesque, misshapen. It was Peter. Or at least it had been once. But now he was something else entirely. His skin was cracked, veins visible beneath the surface. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, staring without recognition. A guttural noise escaped his throat, a twisted echo of the man they had once known. Peter Chadwick was no longer human. He was something far worse. And the officers realized, with growing horror, that they hadn't just walked into a house of horrors. They had stumbled into a place where the very nature of life and death had been distorted. The thing in front of them wasn't alive. It wasn't dead, either. It was something in between. Something that existed to torment, to twist the minds of anyone who dared to come close. And it wasn't finished yet. The officers tried to run, but their feet felt like they were stuck in mud. Every muscle in their bodies screamed to move, but they couldn't. The creature laughed, its voice gurgling, twisted. "Run," it rasped, "but you will never escape." And then it lunged. The officers screamed, but it was too late. The thing was on them, moving with unnatural speed, its hands, those grotesque, twisted hands, reaching out, grabbing hold. One officer was yanked backward, his body crashing into the floor with a sickening thud. Another felt something cold wrap around his throat, squeezing until his vision blurred. The darkness in the room seemed to swallow them whole. Each breath they took felt like it could be their last. The air, thick with fear, pressed in on them from all sides. The creature's laughter echoed, reverberating in their skulls. It was no longer Peter. It couldn't be. The man they had known was gone. What stood before them was something else entirely. A thing of nightmares. Something that had existed in the shadows for far longer than they could imagine. The officers still standing tried to back away, but the walls seemed to close in. It felt like the house itself was alive, its very bones shifting, twisting in response to their fear. The ground beneath them felt unstable, like it was about to crack open and swallow them whole. But it wasn't the house that moved. It was the thing. Peter, if it could still be called that, moved toward the next officer, his eyes never leaving the victim. The others could only watch in horror, paralyzed. One of them managed to raise his gun. Hands shaking, sweat dripping down his face, he aimed at the creature. His finger tightened on the trigger. But it was useless. The bullet flew, but the thing twisted its body impossibly fast, dodging the shot with ease. It laughed again, a deep, mocking sound that echoed in their ears. "You think weapons can stop me?" it rasped. The officer tried to fire again, but the gun was ripped from his hands before he could react. The creature was on him in an instant, sinking its teeth into his neck. A sickening, wet crunch filled the room. The remaining officer stumbled backward, his back hitting the wall. His breath came in sharp, desperate gasps. But there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. It was a nightmare. A living, breathing nightmare. And they were trapped. The thing, Peter or whatever it was, looked up, its eyes glinting in the dim light. It knew there was no escape. It had them now. And they knew, deep down, that they would never leave this house alive. The last officer's heart pounded violently in his chest, as if it might burst at any moment. His back pressed tightly against the cold wall, but the pressure was all around him. The creature, still feeding, slowly straightened up. Its eyes, those unblinking, soulless eyes, shifted toward him. The officer's body trembled uncontrollably. The laughter that filled the room echoed like a distorted melody, rattling his nerves. There was no escape. The house had become a trap, a suffocating labyrinth, where the very walls seemed to close in tighter with every breath. The officer could feel the chill in the air wrap around him like a vice. His body refused to obey his frantic mind. His legs felt like lead. He wanted to run, to flee, but his feet wouldn't move. And then it happened. A voice.
Low, soft,
but unmistakable. "Why are you still here?" The officer's eyes shot to the creature. It spoke, but not in a voice that resembled anything human. It was a rasping, guttural whisper, like something ancient, something forgotten, trying to claw its way into the world. The officer opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was strangled, trapped in his throat. The creature tilted its head, its eyes never leaving his face. It moved closer now, slow and deliberate, savoring the terror that radiated from the officer's every pore. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice thick with malice. "But now you're here, just like the others." The officer couldn't take his eyes off the creature. He felt like it was peeling back every layer of his thoughts, exposing his very soul. It was a predator, toying with its prey. It had always been in control. The officer knew it now. And he could feel something inside him, something that wasn't right. The fear wasn't just in his mind anymore. It was seeping into his very bones. The creature smiled, if you could call it that. A grotesque, jagged stretch of its mouth, exposing teeth that were too sharp, too long. With a sudden lunge, it reached out, its hand grabbing the officer by the throat. He gasped for air, his body lifting off the ground as the thing squeezed tighter. He clawed at its hand, but it was like trying to break free from a steel vise. His vision blurred, the edges of reality slipping away. The walls of the house seemed to pulse, as though they were breathing, alive with dark energy. He could feel it now. The thing wasn't just a monster. It was something older, something darker. And it was feeding, drawing from the fear and despair that had long soaked into these walls. With one last, desperate breath, the officer tried to scream. But the air was gone. And as his vision faded to black, the creature's laughter rang in his ears. It was all that remained. The house, the creature, and the silence. And then there was nothing. The silence settled over the house like a heavy blanket. The creature, its hunger satisfied for the moment, dropped the officer's lifeless body to the ground with a sickening thud. It stepped back, surveying the scene. The air in the house felt different now, almost thicker. It was as if the walls themselves had absorbed the terror, soaking it up like a sponge, making the atmosphere even more oppressive. The house seemed to shift with a life of its own. The once quiet home, now a place of unimaginable horror, whispered with unseen voices, screams and cries from the past trapped within its walls. The creature moved toward the center of the room, its long fingers twitching with satisfaction. It paused, staring at the lifeless bodies of the officers strewn across the floor. And then, it turned toward the stairway, leading further down into the basement. That's where the real horror had begun. That's where it had all started. Peter Chadwick's twisted fate had opened a door. And now it had drawn in others, just as it had always done. The house was never meant to be left behind. It was a prison, a living, breathing tomb. The creature, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, began to retreat into the darkness. But before it disappeared, a low, almost mournful sigh escaped its lips. "Isn't it beautiful?" it whispered to the empty room, the walls seeming to echo back the question. Everything comes full circle in the end. The house seemed to tremble with those words, as if agreeing. The officer's screams still lingered in the air. The creature's hunger was far from over. And for those who stumbled into the House of Horrors, there was no escape. No one would ever leave. Not unless the house itself allowed it. And for now, the house was content to keep its secrets and feed on the fear. The house stood silent, watching, waiting. Its walls had absorbed every drop of fear, every scream, every desperate breath. Time seemed irrelevant here, stretched and distorted, like the air itself had forgotten the concept of passing moments. The creature, now a mere shadow in the darkness, faded from view, blending with the house it had become one with. But something was different. Something was stirring beneath the surface of the house, in the depths of the basement. The scratching noise returned, faint at first, but then growing louder, more frantic. It was as if someone was trying to escape. The house creaked, its timbers groaning as though reacting to the disturbance. Down below, the floorboard shifted. And then, the first glimpse of movement. A figure, hunched and twisted, crawled from the shadows of the basement. It was a pale, emaciated form, its limbs too long, too thin, like something that had been twisted out of shape. The figure moved slowly, almost languidly, dragging itself across the floor. It reached the bottom of the stairs. The creature, now standing in the middle of the room, turned its head. It smiled. But this smile was different. It wasn't the grotesque, jagged grin from before. It was a smile of recognition. The figure on the stairs was Peter Chadwick, or, at least, what was left of him. The one who had opened the door. The one who had unknowingly invited the darkness inside. And now, it seemed, he had returned. But there was something wrong with him. Something deeper than before. His eyes were vacant, hollow, as though his soul had long since been swallowed by the thing that now controlled him. His mouth opened, but no words came out, just a sound, like the dragging of chains across stone. The creature took a step forward, watching Peter with a predatory gaze. And then it spoke. "Did you really think you could escape me?" it said, its voice low and gravelly. Peter didn't respond, but his body shuddered, as though it recognized the voice. The creature reached out, its twisted fingers brushing against Peter's shoulder. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in Peter's eyes, something human. But it was gone just as quickly as it had appeared. The creature's grip tightened and Peter's body stiffened, convulsing. Then, as if understanding its role in the grand scheme of things, Peter slowly straightened up. He turned toward the stairs, his movements jerky and unnatural, but with a sense of purpose. And he began to climb. The house shifted once more, a deep, low rumble rising from within the walls. It was alive again. It was calling to the ones who had been trapped here, calling to the souls that had once been lost in its dark embrace. And as Peter Chadwick, twisted, broken, ascended toward the upper levels, the house seemed to sigh in contentment. The hunger had been fed, but it wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. The house seemed to hold its breath. As Peter Chadwick ascended the stairs, his movements slow and deliberate, the walls of the house creaked, groaned, as though it were stretching itself, preparing for what was to come. Each step Peter took echoed through the house, amplifying the silence. The air grew heavier, thick with anticipation. And then, as if on cue, the house began to shift, its floors creaking and buckling under an unseen weight. The darkness deepened. The light from the flickering candles in the rooms seemed to grow dimmer. It wasn't just the house that had changed. It was the very essence of the place, the spirit of it. It had become something more. Something alive. And with each step Peter took, it seemed to grow stronger. His eyes, once vacant and hollow, flickered with a brief spark of recognition. A memory of who he had been. But it was fleeting. The house pulled him deeper into its grasp, closer to its heart. At the top of the stairs, Peter paused. He was no longer the man he once was. He was an instrument of the house, its puppet, its servant. The house had consumed him. And in doing so, it had unlocked something far worse. A door opened at the end of the hallway, a door that had not been there before. It was made of dark wood, old and weathered, but with a certain beauty that drew the eye. Peter moved toward it. His hands, trembling and broken, reached for the doorknob. With a twist, the door creaked open. And beyond it, in the dim light, the officers who had entered the house before him appeared, twisted, pale versions of themselves, their eyes empty, their bodies contorted in ways that no living creature should have been able to endure. They stood motionless, their limbs at strange angles, as if time had bent them into grotesque sculptures. They were no longer the people they had once been. They had become part of the house. Their souls were trapped in this twisted dimension, forever bound to the house's insatiable hunger. Peter took a step forward, his eyes wide as he beheld them. He reached out, but they didn't move. They didn't need to. They had already been claimed. And as the door fully opened, a deep rumble shook the foundation of the house. A low, deep growl reverberated through the walls. The house was alive now, and it was no longer content with feeding on the souls of the living. It was reaching for more. It was calling out, calling for more to enter, more to become part of its endless cycle of fear and suffering. And in that moment, Peter Chadwick, now a puppet of the house, understood what had happened to him. He had never truly escaped. He had become the house's newest servant. He had become part of its eternal hunger. And as the door closed behind him, the house seemed to sigh in satisfaction. It had another soul, another piece of itself to consume. The cycle would continue, and the house would wait, silently, patiently, for the next one to come. Because the house, it seemed, would never truly be done. The house settled into a deep, uneasy silence once more. But that silence, thick with the weight of history, was deceptive. The hunger still lingered, pulsing beneath the floorboards, in the very walls themselves. Peter Chadwick, if that was even still his name, stood in the darkness of the upper hallway, his form a twisted reflection of the man he once had been. The air around him felt charged, alive with an energy that could not be contained. The house was aware of him, as it was aware of every soul it had ever claimed. And in that moment, Peter knew the truth. He wasn't just a victim of the house.
He was part of it now.
The house had taken his soul, twisted it into something unrecognizable, something that could never escape. He could feel its presence in the air, in every breath he took. It whispered to him, promising that this was how it had always been, how it would always be, endless. The house was a prison, but it was also a living, breathing thing. It had always been hungry, always waiting for the next soul to wander in, to wander too far. It had no concept of mercy, no understanding of escape. Once you entered its grasp, you were trapped. For eternity. Peter shuddered. But there was no use in fighting it anymore. The walls seemed to close in around him, tightening their grip, urging him toward the darkness beyond. He walked, but his steps were slow, deliberate, as if the house was controlling his every movement. The hallway stretched before him, endless, its dim light flickering and fading. Behind him, the door to the basement loomed, its dark shape threatening, calling out to him. The creature, whatever it was, remained somewhere deep within the house. And Peter, now a part of it, knew he would never leave. The house would never let him. He reached the door at the end of the hall, the one that had opened to reveal the twisted, broken versions of the officers. And as the door swung open, the house's grip tightened. The shadows beyond were welcoming, comforting even. But Peter felt no comfort.
He had seen it all now.
And in a way, he understood the dark force that held him captive. The house wasn't just a place. It was a parasite.
Feeding.
Waiting. Always searching for new souls to claim. And as Peter crossed the threshold of the room, the door slammed shut behind him. The last sound he heard was the low, guttural hum of the house as it began to settle into its eternal hunger once more. And as it did, the house seemed to whisper, to the next one, the next soul that would enter its grasp. There was always another, always a new victim to draw in. The cycle never ended. It never would. The house breathed in the silence, savoring the stillness, as if it was waiting for the inevitable next phase of its twisted cycle. Peter's presence, though now bound to it, was only a part of the whole. The house continued to shift and moan, its walls stretching and contracting like a living organism. It had absorbed another soul, but it needed more. It needed to consume. The doors to the house, the windows, everything seemed to pulse with energy. A low, bone-chilling hum vibrated through the air, vibrating the walls. The house was calling, pulling at the very fabric of reality itself. It had fed. It had claimed another, but the hunger would never be satisfied. And in the depths of the house, deep below where Peter now stood, a new door appeared. A door that had not been there before. A door that called to the ones outside. The ones who had yet to come. From the streets, the dark, wet corners of the town, the house would reach out. To the curious. To the desperate. To those who wandered too close. The door would beckon them. It was waiting, ever patient, ever hungry. The creature that had once been Peter stood silently, its body not quite human anymore, not quite the same as the one that had once walked the earth. The officers' bodies still lay around him, twisted and lifeless, but they were not gone. They would never be gone. The house had claimed them, as it would claim others. They would be trapped in this place. The walls, the darkness, the whispers, they would all be part of the house forever. Peter's eyes, hollow and dark, slowly turned toward the next hallway, sensing the shift. Something was coming. Something new. It always started like this. A disturbance. A ripple. A sense of something out of place. But it was too late. The doors had opened. And the next wave was coming. The air shifted, thickened. And in the far distance, the faintest sounds of movement could be heard. Footsteps. The next victims. A scream. Far off in the distance, muffled by the walls, faintly echoed through the house. And then silence. The house waited again, its hunger growing once more. The cycle would begin again. It always did. And for Peter, now part of the dark pulse of the house, there was no escape. There was no end. Only the endless pull of the door. And the waiting hunger. The silence lingered, thick and suffocating, wrapping the house in its cold embrace. The walls trembled slightly, as if the house itself could feel the approach of the new souls it so eagerly anticipated. Outside, the rain began to pour, relentless downpour that seemed to drown out everything else. The streets grew darker, the shadows lengthening, as if they too knew the house's call. The door that had appeared so unexpectedly deep within the house stood silent, waiting for those who would enter. It wasn't just an invitation. It was a trap, a lure, an unyielding beckon to the next soul. The air in the house grew colder. A low wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, carrying with it the scent of decay, of forgotten things. Peter stood motionless, his body now a mere shell of what it once was. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if every part of him had been reassembled to serve the house's insatiable appetite. His eyes, empty, lifeless, stared ahead, unblinking, as though watching the future unfold in front of him.
The house had him now.
And it had no intention of letting go. There was no way out, no means of escape. Peter's existence had become one with the house. Every footstep he took, every breath he drew, was part of its dark rhythm, part of the eternal cycle. The air grew heavier still, thick with the promise of more. The hunger was not just an idea anymore. It was real. It was a force. A quiet creak echoed in the hallway, followed by another, louder now, closer. The house had sensed them. The next victims. The first faint whispers of footsteps were followed by the sharp sound of the front door creaking open. The house sighed in anticipation. From the darkness of the entryway, a shadow crossed the threshold. The figure was tall, wrapped in a long coat, a suitcase in hand. A man curious alone. The house had been waiting for him. Peter's body lurched forward, his unnatural movements coming to life as though propelled by the house itself. He wasn't in control anymore. He never had been. But there was something familiar in the way he moved, something almost human. The man, his back to the shadowed hallway, paused. A low groan echoed from somewhere deep in the house. He turned, but he saw nothing. A cold breeze swept through the door. "Hello," the man called out softly, his voice shaking ever so slightly. The house held its breath. Peter, his eyes still hollow and empty, stepped forward once more. The man froze, his gaze fixing on him. And for a brief moment, Peter's eyes flickered. A shudder passed through him. A flicker of recognition. But it was gone in an instant, swallowed by the depths of the house. The man blinked, his confusion deepening as he took a cautious step forward, reaching for the doorframe. His fingers brushed against the cold wood. The house, as if alive, surged. The door slammed shut behind him. And as the man turned back toward the now sealed doorway, the last sound he heard was the deep, resonant groan of the house, welcoming him into its endless hunger. The man stood frozen, staring at the closed door, his breath quickening as a chilling realization crept over him. He had stepped into something far darker than he had anticipated. The house felt different now, alive, watching. The air grew thicker, pressing in on him from all sides. He took a hesitant step back, but the floor beneath him creaked, as though the house was urging him to stay. "Hello," he called again, his voice wavering. The silence was oppressive, nearly suffocating. A soft rustling echoed from somewhere deep within the house, followed by the faintest shuffle of footsteps. He wasn't alone. His heart began to race, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He turned toward the hallway, but there was nothing there. Then a whisper, barely audible, floated toward him. "Come closer." The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it held an unmistakable edge of something darker, something ancient. The man's feet felt like they were stuck in place, as though the house itself was pulling him in. Another creak. A shadow shifted at the corner of his vision. He stepped forward, unsure of why, but driven by some force beyond his control. And as his foot touched the next step, the house reacted, shifting, groaning. A low, guttural sound reverberated through the floor beneath him. The walls seemed to close in, their once sturdy structure now bending with a life of its own. The man gasped, stumbling backward, but the door had vanished. It was no longer there. The hallway stretched into a dark void, the dim light flickering as if on the brink of going out. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice now trembling, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. The whisper came again, closer this time. "We are the house." The man's breath caught in his throat. The words seemed to come from all around him, as though the very walls were speaking. A cold breeze swept through, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, of forgotten memories. And then, from the depths of the house, another sound joined the whispers, a slow, dragging noise, like something heavy scraping across the floor. Peter, or whatever was left of him, stepped into view, his eyes locked on the man. But his face was no longer human. His features had twisted, distorted by the house's dark influence. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes, hollow and empty, stared at the man with a depth that went beyond the physical. He moved slowly, his limbs jerking unnaturally as if the house itself was puppeteering him, but there was a strange, familiar cadence to his movement, like he knew exactly what he was doing. The man's legs went numb, his body paralyzed with fear. The house was closing in around him. He tried to speak, to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the house's oppressive silence. Peter's lips twitched into a twisted semblance of a smile, the grotesque, jagged smile of something long dead. And as the man watched, paralyzed with terror, Peter's form seemed to stretch, elongating into something far more sinister. A low hum vibrated through the walls, and the house shuddered. It was feeding again. The man's eyes widened as the truth dawned on him. This place, it didn't just trap its victims. It consumed them, turned them into something else, something that would serve the house forever. The man tried to back away, but the walls pushed him forward. They weren't just walls. They were part of the house. They were part of it. Peter's figure grew larger, towering over him now, an almost unbearable weight of darkness pressing down on the man. And as he looked into Peter's eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, the man saw what lay beyond. The same fate that had claimed everyone before him. The same fate he was about to meet. Peter's voice was now a guttural rasp, a sound that tore through the man's mind like a blade. "Welcome home." And with that, the man's body was drawn into the house, his soul pulled into the darkness, becoming yet another part of its endless hunger. The door behind him slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the house, sealing off any trace of the man who had once entered. The house fell silent again, but not in peace. It was just waiting for the next to come. And when they did, it would feed again. Forever. The house stood in the stillness, a sentient, breathing thing, its hunger never truly sated. The doors had opened once more, but now there was a quiet and eerie calm. A lull between the cycles. The latest soul, the man who had unknowingly walked into the house, was lost to its grasp, his body now an extension of its insatiable appetite. His form had been absorbed, twisted, and reshaped into something that could never escape. But even as the house settled into its temporary silence, a shift began in the air. The house, alive with an ancient malevolence, stirred again, its walls quivering with anticipation. There would always be more. The house knew this. It had always known. And as the seasons changed outside, as the rain finally began to clear, a new day would eventually dawn. But it would never reach the house. Not completely. The house had no true concept of time, of light or darkness. It existed in a perpetual state of hunger, feeding off the fear and suffering of those who wandered too close. The voices of those trapped within its walls, lost souls, still echoed faintly through the halls, their whispers a constant presence in the background of the house's unending torment. But the house was patient. It did not rush. It waited. It always waited. The ground outside remained wet, the puddles forming still. The town beyond seemed almost unaware of the house's existence, its darkness, its twisted hunger, an entity hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next victim to wander into its reach. And they always came. One by one they entered, drawn by curiosity, by desperation, by an unseen force they couldn't resist. They would never leave. And as the door to the house stood open once more, it called. It beckoned. It waited for the next to step inside, to add to its ever-growing collection of souls. Because the hunger never ended. And neither would the house. The door waited. The shadows deepened. And somewhere in the darkness, the house whispered its final invitation.
Come.
Become one with us. Forever. The cycle would begin again. As the house sat in its stillness, the world outside continued as if unaware of the terror within. The rain had long since ceased, and the once ominous clouds had parted to reveal a dull, gray sky. Time, it seemed, had passed, yet the house remained unchanged. The door stood open. It always did. And yet, despite the lure, despite the beckoning shadows, there was something different this time. The air, thick with tension and the echoes of countless souls, seemed to tremble with a quiet finality. The hunger of the house, as insatiable as it was, appeared to have reached a quiet pause. No footsteps approached. No curious traveler or lost soul dared to enter. Inside, where the spirits of the trapped lingered, no longer just the living, but those who had become part of the house's endless cycle, a heavy silence settled. The walls, once trembling with the anticipation of another soul, now stood motionless, as if tired, weary. For the first time, the house seemed to realize that there might not be another. That perhaps, in its endless need for more, it had already consumed all that could be consumed. The house, now deeply aware of its own hunger, began to shift again, slowly, subtly, as though questioning its own existence. Was it truly alive? Or was it merely repeating a pattern, a cycle that could never be broken? The whispers of the lost souls still drifted, but there was something different about their tone now. They had accepted their fate, resigned to their role in this dark, never-ending tale. The voices no longer cried out for help. They no longer screamed in terror. They had become one with the house. And so, the door slowly closed. The house fell silent, its hunger momentarily quenched, its grip on the world outside loosened. Perhaps, for now, it had all it needed. And as the world continued its quiet march forward, the house waited. For in the end, it was not about the souls it consumed. It was about the waiting, the never-ending patience. And someday, when the time was right, the house would call again. But until then, it would remain, silent in its dark corner of the world. Forever waiting, forever hungry, forever